Famine declared in one part of war-torn Sudan, where aid has been blocked by the warring sides. Warnings it'll spread throughout the country. As the conflict takes a devastating toll on civilians, what can be done to help them? And is peace possible? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. There's a humanitarian crisis in Sudan, one that could have been prevented. Famine has been declared in Zam Zam. That's a camp sheltering hundreds of thousands of displaced people in the North Darfur region. The crisis is the culmination of 15 months of war that's claimed tens of thousands of lives and displaced more than 11 million people. Aid agencies warn nearly 26 million Sudanese now face acute hunger. That's a sharp increase since the conflict began in April last year. Questions are being raised about how this situation was allowed to deteriorate. So could more have been done to prevent this famine? And what hope is there for the millions still at risk? We'll be discussing this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Axel Zemovich.
In North Darfur, famine has been officially declared in the Zamzam camp, home to 500,000 displaced people. For weeks, fighting between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces has prevented aid from reaching them.
We're suffering from lack of food, water and everything else, but we're staying here, thank God, until now. We're eating simple food, thank God. We need water, food, healthcare, and for God to lift this curse from Sudan, nothing more than that.
The famine is spreading and people in 14 states are at risk, according to the UN's World Food Programme. And nearly half the country's population, that's 25 million people, urgently need humanitarian assistance.
All of the infrastructure is destroyed, so we're not able to use any other form of transport except air. And air is inefficient. It gets us to populations that are besieged, but not necessarily with the volume of assistance that we require right now.
The crisis is widely blamed on events going back to 2019. That's when a nationwide protest toppled longtime President Omar al-Bashir. A transitional government was formed to guide Sudan to democratic elections, but tensions soon emerged between the military and civilian leadership. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, head of the armed forces, and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, leader of the paramilitary rapid support forces, were once allies in the transitional government. But disagreements over military reform led to open conflict in April 2023. Fighting erupted in the capital Khartoum and quickly spread. More than a year later, the country appears divided, with the RSF controlling much of the west, the army holding the east. Sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war, with Human Rights Watch saying fighters on both sides have frequently committed rapes, often in front of victims' families. Last week, after surviving an assassination attempt involving a drone strike, Sudan's military leader General al-Burhan said the armed forces would not negotiate with the RSF. But in a surprising turn of events, he then accepted an invitation to attend US-sponsored peace talks in Geneva. It's the first significant effort in months to bring the army and the RSF to the negotiating table.
If there are negotiations, it is assumed that it recognizes the Sudanese state. This state must be recognized, and based on that, we can negotiate.
As the generals fight for power, civilians are paying the price. Millions have been repeatedly displaced. And with famine taking hold, time is running out for the most vulnerable people in Sudan. Axel Zemovich, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. And in New York, Sudanese political analyst and broadcaster Kholood Khair. In Cairo, Amgad Fareid Eltayeb, executive director of the non-partisan think tank Fikra for Studies and Development. And in Sudan, William Carter is the Norwegian Refugee Council's country head. He's currently in the east in Port Sudan, where the Sudanese armed forces have rebased since the RSF took over most of Khartoum. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. William, Famine has been declared in the west, in Darfur, in Zamzam camp. We're going to be talking much more about that in just a minute. First of all, I want to get a situational report from you as to what it's like in the east, where the Norwegian Refugee Council is able to operate, able to access. What is the situation on the ground there?
It's a terrible situation, Laura. I mean, we have this famine elsewhere in Sudan, and we also have this war that's raging that's displaced more than 10 million people, almost 750,000 people displaced again in the last month or so as the RSF had assaulted another state, Sennar. And I was just with our teams in Gedaref, quite close to the front lines, trying to help people that had been walking for days, not even with shoes, through the mud, carrying a few belongings, some of them pregnant, some of them elderly, heading to a city which really doesn't have much relief at all, completely overcrowded situation there. So it's a really terrible situation on the ground, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in other parts of the country too.
Yeah, many hundreds of thousands of people are at future risk of famine. We've heard that from reports on the ground. Just how precarious is the situation at large?
It's hugely precarious. I mean, we're at the beginning of food insecurity crisis. It begins with a famine in a specific camp, but none of the trends are positive. We've got such a large-scale situation, almost 25 million people or so in different states of food insecurity, some at extremely critical or catastrophic levels. And so this massive humanitarian catastrophe within the country can turn even worse and also embroil the entire region.
Kholood, let's turn our attention to this camp, Zam Zam, where hundreds of thousands of people are displaced. Famine has been declared there. Can you tell us what that actually means on the ground for the people who are living there?
Well, reports from Zam Zam and the areas around Zam Zam indicate that people have been in famine for quite some time. And this means that we're seeing the kind of developmental indicators and humanitarian indicators that really now, I think, are at their zenith. And we're seeing this in other parts of North Darfur as well as other parts of the country, particularly those under the control of the non-Juba peace agreement signatories and armed movements. So really, this is an endemic issue. But when it comes to Zamzam, I mean, we have to understand that these are people who have been in displacement for decades now. And there are children who have been born into displacement at Zamzam camp who have known nothing but this life. And these are the children specifically that are now very much feeling the brunt of this very much man-made famine, and who have basically been borne the brunt of state violence in Sudan for decades now. And I think this is what makes this particular announcement in Zamzam camp all the more devastating.
When we talk about famine, can you detail for us what an average family in Zamzam would be eating or not eating on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think the answer is very little. People have had to rely on leaves, people have had to rely on weeds, people have had to rely on whatever it is they can get access to, whether it's from UN agencies like UNHCR, etc. But those agencies themselves report that they have been able to get very little into the Zamzam area because it is being besieged by the rapid support forces. And there are very few entryways and humanitarian pathways where food can be brought into the area. There's also not very much that can be grown right now. Several agricultural seasons have failed. And so really people are eating mud in some areas and eating whatever it is they can get their hands on. And that is why we will continue to see the levels of deaths in areas like Zamzam skyrocket in the next few months.
Amgad, this declaration of famine itself is quite interesting because there's very little access to this area. That's part of the problem. So how is such a declaration made? Because it's interesting that the Sudanese government is denying that it exists.
I don't think that referring to whatsoever hostility in Port Sudan as the Sudanese government is completely correct. there have been a coup period to this war in October 2021, in which both warring parties, both General Burhan and General Hemedti, were enacting on toppling the government. However, I think the question of access is not the right question. There is a problem of availability of the aid itself. Now, by the end of July 2024, the humanitarian plan for Sudan have been only around 30% funded, and this is the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. I think that the international community, when they talk about access, they are just trying to find justification of the lack of interest in really resolving the Sudanese humanitarian crisis.
It's interesting that you say that, because UN food trucks are not able to enter Sudan via the Adre border crossing. That's on the border between Sudan in the west, in the North Darfur region, and Chad. They're being forced by the Sudanese armed forces to go further north and enter at a northern point. Why are they not allowed to enter Adre, which is the easiest and most accessible border crossing for huge numbers of food trucks that are available to go in?
I think, Aurora, you need to revise many of the statements that you just made about about how Adre is more easier than Altina. Adre is giving you access to RSF-controlled areas of Guinea and West Darfur that witnessed a massacre in June last year, in which around 300 Sudanese of the Masalit community were killed at the hand of the RSF. The same RSF which have been looting or have looted around 40,000 liters of fuel in the past few weeks from the UN agencies, and the UN kept silent about it. And I think that there is legitimate concerns from the South, from Sudanese armed forces, that whatsoever aid crossing through the RSF-controlled territories is being looted by the RSF and being covered as well by the UN agencies. One part of this crisis in Sudan that it has been always described as man-made without clearly defining who's that man. There is a famine in Sudan, but it's deliberately made by the rapid support forces.
Kholood, undoubtedly the RSF is to blame for much of the situation in Sudan, but to what extent can we place the blame at the feet of the Sudanese armed forces as well, and indeed the UN for not pressuring them more to open up crossings such as Adre to food trucks?
Very much so, because you have to remember that in Sudan, starvation as a weapon of war has been a tactic used by the security establishment for decades. And people who know anything about Sudanese history will remember this tactic and this strategy being used in what is now South Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains, in Blue Nile, etc. So none of this is new. The famine is exacerbated by the war, but it is in and of itself a strategy for war. And this is why we're seeing the Sudanese armed forces try to limit what the amount of aid that can come in through Adre, even though they do not control that border point. And as you say, the UN here is entirely complicit, because why on earth should an entity and a warring party that does not control a border get a say over who crossing that border when there are many, many people who would benefit from that border being crossed? And yes, there are risks that the RSF might take food. They have done before. That is well documented. But there is a humanitarian imperative here that trumps any claim of sovereignty, either by the SAF or the RSF, and the UN not questioning that, as they did in Syria, along with other NGOs and in other contexts before, really puts a lot of Sudanese people, millions of Sudanese people, at risk. When we compare Adre to the Tina crossing, Tina is currently underwater and completely impassable. And so Adre is the only option that remains. And not using Adre, entirely allowing the two warring parties to dictate the terms of aid delivery, is absolutely buying into the starvation as a weapon of war strategy.
William, when you've got both sides blocking aid from reaching the people, how difficult is it on a day-to-day basis for aid organisations such as yours to do your work?
It's extremely difficult. This is a massive scale of response that's required. It's a very vast country, logistically complex. We don't have the financial resources. So then to have all the bureaucratic and security challenges that come with not just a war, but how this war has been approached by the different parties to this conflict, it's dramatic. So we would have been able to do much more, much earlier, had there been easier access on this. To be honest, the international community has done too little to prevent this tragedy, which we knew was coming for months. And I agree with Kholood's readout of the situation. We really need to push forward to make sure that all border crossings are open so we can get humanitarian relief to the people who most need it, in light especially that there's a famine brewing.
Amgad, let's look at the international response, because the numbers in Sudan are staggering by any standard. 25 million people, half of the population in need of urgent humanitarian aid, 8.5 million people facing extreme food shortages. And yet there is no sense of urgency amongst the international community to act. Why not?
I think there is deeply embedded racism in the international political system, and there are too many competing crises that are competing for the interest of the international community. But this is not the only thing. There is this engagement or participation of this elusive narrative about the war in Sudan that try to cover the real causes behind it. And as I mentioned, a big part of the blame falls on the shoulder of the RSF. But there is also the engagement of the UAE in the attempt to cover and whitewash the intentional blockade that the RSF and the starvation siege that RSF is putting on increasing the humanitarian suffering in Sudan. But this does not make this does not say that there is no blame on SAF. But you cannot compare the passive bureaucratic impediment and the passive blockade that how SAF is making it difficult for the humanitarian actors to work and to equate it to the active looting and burning and destruction of the infrastructure of the agricultural system and the displacement and all the active deeds and active crimes that the RSF is doing. First, we need to set the narrative right, and then we address the root causes of this crisis in order to save it.
OK, well, there could well be an opportunity to do that next week. Kholood, we've got US-sponsored ceasefire talks due in Geneva. Both sides have accepted that they will attend. But the question is, do you think they'll show up?
Well, the question isn't whether they'll show up, it's who will show up. The Americans have asked for the senior leadership of either side. That's General Burhan on the SAF side and General Hemeti on the RSF side. And the RSF have said that they will come because they're very eager to put their best foot forward when it comes to the international community. They've committed so many egregious crimes in Sudan that they're very desperate for that international legitimacy. SAF, on the other hand, has been more reticent around this. And the assassination attempt on Burhan last week has made them more hesitant, shall we say, to send the leadership. Now, of course, if Burhan says unequivocally that he himself will not go, then of course neither will General Hemeti, and perhaps even neither will the senior representation on the US side. So we might end up with an event in Switzerland that is actually much less high profile, wherein you have, sort of mid-ranking or middle-level representation from both sides, and similarly from the United States and other mediators. What that would mean is that there is still an opportunity to discuss some of the security issues and, more importantly, some of the humanitarian and protection issues, even if the ceasefire talks at the top level won't go ahead. Now, here's the thing that I think is important to stress. A ceasefire in Sudan will not save lives. In fact, historically, ceasefires lead to more loss of life. So I think this is really not necessarily the thing we need to be focusing on right now. The way to save lives right now is through protection mechanisms, is through massively surging humanitarian aid and the humanitarian response.
Will, do you think that the talks in Geneva will prioritise the humanitarian response, and how might that look? How should it be changing to properly address the desperate needs of people in Sudan?
I mean, it will take some deft diplomacy to bring the sides together on agreeing. Humanitarian access is one of the points for discussion. To be honest, it doesn't need to happen like this. We're glad that there's pressure, and especially with a famine now declared and massive displacement and continuing war, there should be more pressure on both sides to comply with international humanitarian law and allow aid access in. So I'm hopeful that it will be tabled. It's not clear how easy it will be to bring an outcome of this event. We remain hopeful, but to be honest, we're still preparing for the worst and a continuation. We have to. Many of our teams see communities where a child is dying every day, with families that maybe have one meal a day. And as Kholood said, even if there is a Hail Mary ceasefire that comes out of this, we're still months away from stopping hundreds of thousands of people dying.
Amgad, these talks they're co-hosted by Saudi, Egypt, the UAE. As you mentioned before, they have a stake in this fight. Can you explain how these outside forces, and also we must look at Russia and Iran that are sort of coming in to support the SAF, how they are exacerbating and fueling this war and making it ever difficult to come to a conclusion?
And also don't forget the US and Israel, who also have their vested interest on the situation. There are too many foreign interests that are competing in Sudan, and they are competing at the cost of the Sudanese people. However, the evident engagement of Emirates have been the most cardinal signs of foreign intervention in Sudan. Just recently, they supplied the RSF with this new bombardment tools that they have been bombing Al-Fashir with it for the last few weeks, without actually enforcing the previous agreements and without enforcing the UN Security Council resolution, especially Resolution 1591 that prohibit the supply of weapons to Darfur, which UAE have clearly and repeatedly breached. I think it would be very difficult to stop the war in Sudan. What we need from the international community is to keep away from this war, and this would be the first step towards ending it.
Kholood, we mustn't overlook the importance, the significance of Sudan's civil organisation, the local network of resistance committees, local volunteers who are highly active in communities. They, in many instances, are the ones supporting people in this dire time. How can the international community better make use of this vast network on the ground in providing aid, providing cash, and actually helping to alleviate the situation?
Well, at first, the international community basically roundly ignored these mutual aid groups and volunteer groups on the ground. And then once they realized that they were the only ones who could deliver, there has now been sort of a slight reversal where there's been too much pressure on them to really meet the tasks of the day, which is to distribute humanitarian aid. And I think there needs to be a happy medium. These groups have been saying themselves that they want to work in partnership with international aid organizations and structures to better deliver aid. They don't want to be, sort of the end of the line deliverers in an otherwise very top heavy system. They are very cost efficient. They use every single penny. They don't take many overheads. They have shown value. They work and have the trust of communities, and therefore they should be part of the decision making about how aid gets spent in the first place, rather than just being relegated to sort of implementing partners. That shift has happened. And we have seen actually the international community, particularly the UN agencies, very much resist localization, something that they have paid lip service to for years now, in favor of, sort of calling the access card and saying that they cannot themselves deliver. This, of course, does not make life for Sudanese people any easier, and the structures are there. They just need to be properly used.
Okay, so the UN might not be properly using it, William, but is the Norwegian Refugee Council properly using these structures?
We're a close partner to many, and I think that they're doing their level best, helping hundreds of thousands of people in particularly difficult parts of the country. So, Kholood also, Amgad will be, favourable on their role. I think that it's clear they have a place at humanitarian decision making. But more importantly for me, they're one of the few stories that give me hope for Sudan. It's such a bleak context, whichever way you look, militarily, politically, in terms of humanitarian response. But these Sudanese families, Sudanese communities banding together to provide communal kitchens, to provide collective shelters, to continue medical works need to be supported. We're trying to support. It's a very politically difficult situation within the country. Volunteers face a lot of their own safety risks, so we're trying to do it in a sensitive manner, but we completely agree that they need to be supported and as soon as it's possible to be very open, and we want to do this on a much larger scale.
Amgad, just in the last minute that we have left, a very stark question for you. Can widespread famine across Sudan be averted?
Yes, what we need is to stop the war and everything can be averted. And we don't have the luxury of guessing. What we need is to actually act and act now. Not only to stop the famine, but to stop the active killing, looting, raping, and destruction of infrastructure and destruction of whole Sudan. But yes, the answer is always yes.
Okay, all right. Well, on that hopeful note, we will leave it there. Kholood Khair, Amgad, Fareid, Eltayeb, and William Carter, many thanks for joining us here today. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.